Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that's kind of a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like one of humanity's biggest and oldest questions. Do we actually have free will?
The big one.
Yeah. Or are our lives, all our choices, already set in stone?
It's a question that's been bugging philosophers and scientists for centuries.
Absolutely. And we've got some amazing philosophical and scientific sources that might help us untangle this whole concept. What do you say? You ready to go deep?
Let's dive in.
Perfect. So let's start by going all the way back to ancient Greece, where so much of Western thought started. We've got Plato, who seems to connect freedom with self-control.
Right. For Plato, being truly free meant using your reason to control your desires, make good choices.
Okay.
He even compared it to a charioteer.
Oh.
Trying to control two wild horses.
I like that. So the horses represent our passions, and reason is the charioteer, trying to keep them on track.
Exactly.
So what happens if you can't control those horses, though?
Well, Plato believed if you let your impulses take over, then you weren't really free. You were a slave to your desires.
That makes a lot of sense. But then we have Aristotle, who seems to focus more on the act of choosing itself. It's not just about controlling yourself, but about making the choice.
Yeah, for Aristotle, it was all about that process, thinking things through and then making a choice. He thought that's how we become good people, by making good choices. And all those choices we make, over time, they build our character.
So by constantly making good choices, we're essentially training ourselves to be good.
Exactly. It's like building a habit.
Okay, I can see how that works.
Mm-hmm.
But is that really free will? I mean, aren't all those choices influenced by things we can't control? Like our genes, how we were raised, even our environment?
That's a really good point. And it's where things start to get more complex. Even Aristotle knew there were all these outside influences. But then you have Alexander of Aphrodisia.
Who studied Aristotle's work really closely. He argued that even with all those things shaping us, we still have this power to choose differently.
So even if our upbringing or our environment's kind of pushing us in one direction, we can still choose another path. Sounds like there's this tug of war going on between what influences us and our ability to choose.
You got it. And the debate gets even wilder when we look at modern philosophy, where they use these thought experiments to really mess with our ideas about free will.
Thought experiments. Okay, give me an example.
All right, imagine this. A neuroscientist who can secretly put this device in someone's brain. And this device, it can control their thoughts, their actions, even who they vote for. Like, say this person was going to vote for candidate A, but the scientist wants them to vote for candidate B.
Yeah.
They just flip a switch on the device and boom, the person changes their mind.
Okay, that's a little scary, but does that mean the person's choice was completely taken away? Well, that's the question. These thought experiments, they're called Frankfurt-style cases. They make us wonder, if we can find a cause for someone's choice, even if it's hidden, does that mean their will was truly free? Or was it already decided by the scientist?
It's like we're talking about two different levels of reality here. You have what's physically happening in the brain with all its complex stuff.
Yeah.
And then what we actually experience in our minds where it feels like we're making the decisions.
That's the heart of it. How do these two things fit together? Do our feelings of freedom even matter if our choices are ultimately decided by our brains?
Or maybe something else.
Right. Who knows?
So we've got Plato's charioteer, Aristotle focusing on making good choices, and now this scientist secretly controlling votes. And we haven't even gotten to the actual science yet.
Oh yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. Neuroscience, with all its brain scanning and whatnot, throws a whole new wrench into this whole free will debate.
So bring on the neuroscience. What do scientists have to say about all of this?
Well, one of the most famous, maybe infamous experiments was done by this guy named Benjamin Libet.
Oh.
He had people hooked up to brain scanners and asked them to do really simple things, like move their wrist whenever they felt like it.
Sounds simple enough.
But get this, he found brain activity related to the decision to move way before people were even aware of making the decision.
Hold on, so our brains are making the decision before we even know it.
That's what it looked like.
Does that mean free will is just an illusion?
That's what a lot of people thought when this research came out. It seemed like our conscious minds were just along for the ride, catching up to decisions our brains had already made.
That's kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
But if we dig a little deeper, do those findings really rule out free will completely?
That's the thing, right? And newer research has actually started to challenge those early interpretations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some studies are suggesting that the brain activity Libet saw might just be background noise, random stuff that doesn't actually cause the decision.
Okay, so there's still hope for free will?
Maybe.
Tell me more about these newer studies. What are they finding?
Well, there's a whole line of research looking at what they call veto power.
Veto power?
Yeah, it means that even if a decision starts unconsciously, we seem to have this power to stop it before we actually do it.
Okay, like when I'm reaching for another cookie, but then I think, no, I shouldn't.
Right, exactly.
And I stop myself.
Yeah, that's veto power. And this ability to veto, to consciously override an impulse, it suggests that we're not just puppets, controlled by our brains. It hints that maybe we do have some conscious control over our actions.
That makes sense. But it's still pretty crazy to think about all this stuff going on beneath the surface, outside our awareness.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what else our brains are deciding without us knowing.
That's the big mystery, right? If so much is happening unconsciously, how much control do we really have? And what does that mean for things like, if we do something wrong, are we really responsible?
Morally responsible.
Yeah.
It's a huge question.
It really is. If our actions are basically set by our brains or our genes or even just random stuff happening, can we really be blamed for what we do?
It makes you rethink everything, the legal system, how we understand ourselves, everything.
It definitely challenges some fundamental assumptions.
So we've covered a lot of ground already. Plato's charioteer of reason, Aristotle's idea that we shape ourselves through choices.
Right.
And then those thought experiments that really make you question how choice works. Plus, we had a glimpse into what neuroscience is saying about how our brains make decisions.
Yeah, a whirlwind tour of free will so far.
And it sounds like this is only the beginning.
Oh yeah, we're just getting started. There's a whole universe of ideas to explore, from the mind-bending world of quantum physics to the questions raised by artificial intelligence. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed so far before we jump into those even deeper waters.
That was good to me.
So before we went off on that tangent, we were talking about how much control we really have if our brains are making decisions before we even know it.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is, and it brings up some pretty huge questions about, are we truly responsible for the things we do?
Right, if our actions are already predetermined by our brains, or maybe even something else, can we really be held accountable for our choices? Like, should we punish people for crimes if they couldn't have actually acted differently?
Those are some heavy questions. Philosophers and legal experts have been grappling with those for centuries.
Yeah.
So let's just say for a minute that this kind of free will, the kind some philosophers talk about, doesn't really exist. Does that mean our whole justice system just crumbles?
I'm thinking, yeah, but I know it can't be that simple.
You're right, it's not. Even if we don't have this, perfect free will, we can still hold people responsible in a practical sense.
What do you mean responsible in a practical sense?
It's about understanding that even if our choices are influenced by things outside of our control, we still need to live in a society, right?
Yeah.
And that society needs to discourage stuff that's harmful and encourage actions that benefit everyone.
So it's not about punishment exactly, but more about the consequences of our actions. We still need laws, and we need consequences for breaking those laws, even if we don't have perfect free will.
Exactly. Think about, training a dog.
Okay.
You're trying to teach it not to jump on the furniture.
Right.
The dog might really want to jump up there, but it learns that if it does, there will be unpleasant consequences. So does the dog have free will in that philosophical sense?
I don't know.
Maybe, maybe not. But the training still works, right?
Right.
Because the dog learns that certain actions lead to certain outcomes.
So it's more about setting up a system of incentives and deterrents that help guide people's behavior. Whether those behaviors are ultimately free or not, that's kind of a separate issue.
You got it. And this way of thinking, it can actually be more compassionate than just punishing people for stuff they did in the past.
I see what you mean. Like, if we can understand the things that might lead someone to commit a crime, like poverty or mental illness, then we can focus on helping with those root causes instead of just locking people up.
Exactly. And that's where neuroscience can really make a difference. It can help us understand how our brains work, what influences our choices, and how we can create environments that lead to better choices.
So instead of getting stuck in this endless debate about whether free will exists or not, maybe a better question is, how can we make the best choices we can given the limits of our biology and our environment?
That's a really great way to put it. Even if we don't have total free will, understanding our brains can give us more control over our actions and our lives.
I like that. It's not about denying the influence of our biology or our past.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to make more conscious, deliberate choices in the present.
Yes. It's about taking responsibility for our actions, even if we realize those actions are shaped by things beyond our control.
And that responsibility goes beyond just, not committing crimes.
Oh, of course.
It applies to everything, our relationships, our careers, how we grow as people.
Absolutely. The more we understand ourselves, our strengths, our weaknesses, our tendencies, the better we can make choices that match our values and goals.
So even if we don't have this, absolute free will,
Right.
we can still strive to make our lives more meaningful, more intentional.
Exactly. We aren't just passive passengers in life. We can actively shape our own destinies.
This is really shifting my perspective on free will. It's less about being completely unconstrained by the past and more about understanding our limitations and using them to make the best choices possible.
I love that. It's like maybe we can't choose our starting point in life, but we can choose how we react to challenges, learn from mistakes, and keep growing.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those ancient philosophers we talked about earlier. Like Plato, he was all about self-mastery, using reason to guide our actions. And then Aristotle, he emphasized good habits and practice, how they shape our character. Even without perfect free will, we can still develop virtues, build good habits, and try to make choices that match our values.
It's not about throwing out everything we thought we knew about morality and choice. It's more like refining our understanding based on new information.
I like that.
Pursuing virtue, building character, realizing how important it is to take responsibility for our actions. These are all still important, even in a world where our choices might be influenced by things we're not consciously aware of.
This is all super interesting, but there's a part of me that still finds it a bit unsettling. If so much of what we do is driven by things we don't consciously control, does that diminish our sense of self? Who are we, really, if we're not the ones truly calling the shots?
That's a deep question, and one that's really puzzled philosophers and scientists for a long time. It gets at the core of what it means to be a conscious being in a universe that operates according to physical laws. It's something we can definitely keep exploring.
So where do we go from here? We've covered ancient philosophy, thought experiments, neuroscience. What else can help us understand this whole free will thing?
Oh, there's so much more. We've barely scratched the surface. We could look into quantum physics, for example, or what artificial intelligence might tell us about free will. There's a whole universe of ideas out there waiting to be explored.
So we're back and ready to keep exploring this whole free will thing.
We sure are. There's still so much to unpack.
Before we took a break, we were discussing this concept of agency within constraints. Even if we're not totally free in the classic sense of the word, we still have the power to make choices.
Right, within certain boundaries.
Exactly.
And as we move forward, it's good to consider some ideas that, challenge how we usually think about this determinism versus free will thing.
Okay, I'm all for challenging assumptions.
Some thinkers propose that quantum physics, it kind of throws another wrench in the whole debate.
Quantum physics.
Yeah.
That's the science of the really, really tiny, right?
That's the one.
I'm not sure I see how that connects to making choices.
I get it. It's not an obvious connection. But what's fascinating about quantum mechanics is that it introduces randomness and uncertainty at the most basic level of reality.
Okay.
And some physicists and philosophers, they think that this randomness, this inherent unpredictability, it could actually influence our brains and the decisions we make.
So instead of a universe where everything's predetermined, we've got this universe where things just happen randomly.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean our choices are just flipping a coin?
Not exactly. Quantum randomness, it doesn't mean our choices are completely arbitrary. Think of it like this. Our brains operate at a level where quantum mechanics might be playing a role. So even the tiniest, most random fluctuation could have this ripple effect, leading to bigger changes in our brain activity. And those changes could then influence our thoughts and actions.
So not every decision is like heads or tails, but there's this element of unpredictability that could be affecting our brains. But does that actually mean we have free will?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Even if quantum randomness is a factor in our brains, does that equal conscious choice? Some argue it's just another form of determinism.
Meaning we're still not truly in control.
Yeah, we're still at the mercy of forces beyond our control, just that those forces might be random instead of predictable.
So even when we dive into quantum physics, The debate about free will rages on. But even if quantum physics can't definitively say, yes, free will exists, it adds a really interesting layer to the conversation.
Absolutely. It makes us question cause and effect, the role of consciousness, how our experiences connect with the physical world. It gets deep.
You know, it reminds me of those thought experiments we discussed earlier, like that one with the neuroscientist who can control someone's vote. If these random quantum events are happening in our brains, is it kind of like having these tiny little neuroscientists constantly tweaking our decisions?
That's a great analogy. It really highlights how hard it is to reconcile this feeling of being in control with what science tells us about how our brains actually work.
So, where do we land after all this? We've explored philosophy, neuroscience, we even touched on quantum physics. Do we have free will or not?
One of the key takeaways here is that there isn't a simple answer. The free will question, it's incredibly complex. It involves philosophical ideas, scientific discoveries, and our own personal experiences.
So is it all just a mystery then? Are we going to be debating this forever without ever finding a satisfying answer?
I wouldn't say that. Even if we can't totally solve the free will puzzle, just thinking about these questions can be super valuable. It forces us to look at our assumptions about who we are, our place in the universe, the nature of reality itself.
It's not just about getting to the right answer. It's about the journey, the questions we ask along the way.
Exactly. And this exploration, it can lead to greater self-awareness, a deeper understanding of how our minds work, and a more compassionate view of how we handle this idea of moral responsibility.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Here's a final thought to chew on. If our brains are constantly predicting and simulating the future, are we truly present in the moment? Or are we always a little bit behind, stuck in our brain's predictions? And how does that affect our whole concept of free will?
That's a mind bender for sure. If my brain's already figuring out what I'll do before I even decide, am I really in control? Or am I just acting out a script my brain's already written?
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it points to the fact that even with everything science can tell us about the brain, there's still so much we don't know about consciousness. It's a deep mystery.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the question of free will, a question that's both fascinating and frustrating, and one that ultimately remains unanswered.
It's been a pleasure. And until next time, keep those brain cells firing.